This episode is brought to you by CrimeCon. CrimeCon is a celebration of all things true crime, featuring many of the personalities and experts from the documentaries, books, and podcasts you enjoy. CrimeCon is a convention taking place in Indianapolis this June. Head to the website www.crimecon.com for more details. And if you're interested in registering, use the code Unresolved to save 20% of your registration cost. Tyson and I are both hoping to be at CrimeCon, and I may have some Unresolved podcast t-shirts with me, so I hope to see you all there. This episode is also brought to you by supporters on Patreon. Head to patreon.com/unresolvedpod for more details, or listen through to the end of the episode to learn more. In the years since pulling Roger James from the Torrens River back in 1972, Bevan Spencer von Einem had lived a relatively mundane life, at least from the outside looking in. He was now an accountant for a supplies company, edging closer to 40 years old, and he lived with his mother in a small house in northeastern Adelaide. However, it turns out that on the side of his everyday good old boy demeanor that endeared himself to his mother's older friends and played it nice at work, he was a sexual sadist that liked to abduct, drug, sexually assault, and occasionally murder young men between the ages of 13 and 25. When one looked at Bevan Spencer von Einem, they didn't see a monster. When most people looked at him, they saw a man who wasn't terrible looking, despite having a very particular look. He had a very large chin, and his hair had been prematurely graying since he was 16 years old. He needed to frequent a hairdresser, a friend of his named Dennis St. Dennis, at least once a month in order to bring it back to the darkened shade of his youth. One word I've seen used to describe Bevan Spencer von Einem is soft. I think that's a pretty apt description of him, because he looks exactly like what you'd imagine an accountant from the 1980s to look like. Bevan von Einem apparently suffered from insomnia and other sleep issues, which had forced him to resort to late-night, alcohol-fueled drives around Adelaide to comfort himself. Later, it resulted in him having prescriptions to multiple sleep agents, such as Mandrax and Rohypnol. This is what put him on the map of police, now investigating the high-profile murder of Richard Kelvin. Hello, welcome to the Unresolved podcast. I'm your host, Micheal Whelan, and this episode is part 2 of my take on the family murders. If you haven't listened to part 1, I highly encourage you to do just that, because this episode is a direct continuation of that story, so you might be a bit lost. Before I officially begin the episode, I have to make a mention of something. In the last episode, I prefaced the story with a pre-apology, warning anyone that my terminology when it came to certain things might not be up to snuff. Throughout the episode, I utilized words such as transsexual and homosexual, both of which were, I later discovered, unacceptable. I apologize to anyone that may have been offended by the usage of those words, and I promise that this is a mistake I will remedy in the future. In an episode full of dark and grisly acts, I honestly didn't concern myself with looking up the proper terminology, and that is unacceptable on my part. For that, I am sorry. I can only hope that it didn't detract from the story itself, which is one that desperately needs to be told. I also apologize, in that I'm still recovering from a really bad case of allergies. I recently made the move from the west coast to Georgia, and it turns out that I'm allergic to the south. Who knew? Anyhow, if my voice sounds a little bit scratchy, that's why. To recap the last episode, in 1979, the body of 16-year-old Alan Barnes was found, having been drugged and sexually assaulted by his killer before being dumped along the bank of the South Para Reservoir. Within months, police discovered another body, that of 25-year-old Neil Muir, a known vagrant and drug user, which had been mutilated almost beyond recognition. He, too, had been raped, just like Barnes. They thought that they found their suspect, Dr. Peter Milhouse, but that lead turned out to be a dead end, and he was eventually acquitted of all charges. The murders seemed to cool off for a couple of years, but in 1981, 14-year-old Peter Stogneff went missing. His body would not be found for over a year, and during that time, 18-year-old Mark Langley would go missing after an argument with his friends next to the Torrens River. A little over a week later, Mark Langley's body would pop up, having been drugged and having the same sexual wounds as Alan Barnes and Neil Muir. A few months later, a farmer who was burning away the dead crops on his vast acres of land stumbled upon the charred remains of Peter Stogneff. Police were not able to find any evidence from his remains, but they did find the same type of saw wounds that had been used to mutilate Neil Muir's body, so they linked him to the same killer as well. Then, in 1983, 15-year-old Richard Kelvin was abducted in just a block away or so from his home in North Adelaide. Richard was the son of Channel 9 News anchor Rob Kelvin, and his disappearance gave the investigation the highest profile imaginable. The search to find Richard Kelvin ended just shy of 2 months later, when geologists stumbled upon his body in the Mount Crawford forest. He had been held for at least a month by his abductor, and had the same horrifying sexual wounds as the other victims. And just like Alan Barnes and Mark Langley, he had been drugged by a variety of chemical agents, the most noteworthy of which was Mandrax, a prescription drug. When police began to look at who had been prescribed Mandrax in the past, a familiar name popped up: Bevan Spencer von Einem. He had been implicated in 3 of the 4 abductions thus far, and with this link, police were able to take a further look at von Einem and his associates. This is the story of the family. Police began to dig in further to investigate von Einem and the allegations regarding him. An anonymous caller, who would later become known to detectives, had called just 2 days after the murder of Alan Barnes, alleging that von Einem was responsible. When he'd been questioned about it, he'd admitted to being gay, and admitted to a prior relationship with Neil Muir, the second victim. Then, apparently, after the discovery of the 4th victim, Mark Langley's body, von Einem had been investigated again, when it cropped up that he may or may not have sexually assaulted 2 young men down by the Torrens River in the weeks beforehand. When questioned about Mark Langley, he denied any involvement, but admitted that he had been in the area on the night in question, and he had been both drinking and driving. Now, police had a direct link between him and the crimes: a prescription to Mandrax, the sedative that had been used to drug at least 2 of the victims. Investigators were now not only linking him to the sexual assault of a teenage boy named George, a story that I told in the prior episode, but also the murders of Mark Langley and Richard Kelvin. Police were now eager to question von Einem, doing so surprisingly. They questioned his whereabouts on the night of Richard Kelvin's disappearance, and he quickly responded with an alibi: that he'd been sick. Apparently, he'd contracted the flu in the early weeks of June, and had actually taken an entire week off of work to recover. Of course, this wasn't much of an alibi at all. It just basically served as an admittance of having an excess of time to himself. He had a doctor's note, but the appointment had been a quick one, in which he was prescribed more drugs to sleep and recover. During this same bout of questioning, he revealed to investigators that he had been prescribed Mandrax for his insomnia, which he also treated by driving around for countless hours during the night and drinking alcohol. He also spilled that he had been prescribed Rohypnol in the past. Roofies for short. Police inquired if he would consent to a search of his property. Not only his home, but both of his vehicles. He responded by telling the investigators that he no longer owned 2 cars, just the one. His other vehicle, a Ford Falcon, had been sold just a month beforehand, in June. This also happened to be roughly a week after Richard Kelvin's body had been dumped in the Mount Crawford forest, and he had gone through the effort of repainting the trunk before selling it to a family friend. He had not repainted the entire car. No, just the trunk. When police inquired about his connections to the victims, von Einem had quick answers that seemed prepared. In one of his first interviews with detectives, he had made a small quip about being held up by a man of either Italian or Greek heritage. And in this interview, he told a similar story about a different incident involving a man of Lebanese descent. He seemed to deflect questions by attacking minority groups, detectives thought. Then, when asked if he would ever commit an act such as murder, he responded by saying that it was unethical, which detectives viewed as a very odd response to the free-form question. Normally people just say that they would never do that because it's wrong, but I guess just the thought of saying it's unethical just sounded weird to them. Needless to say, investigators quickly realized that they had found their man. Now they just needed to prove it. After the first victim, Alan Barnes, had disappeared, Adelaide police had received a phone call. This was back in 1979, before they would learn about the depths of this unknown killer's depravity. They still believed that Barnes had been killed by someone known to him, making the crime a personal one, and not the act of a sexual sadist. The phone call, made by an anonymous caller 2 days after Alan Barnes' body had been found, alleged that the young man had been murdered by Bevan Spencer von Einem. Now with von Einem in their sights, Investigator O'Brien and his colleagues wanted to get back to that original caller, to find out all that they knew. Surprisingly, they were able to track down the caller. I'll simply refer to him as Investigator O'Brien does in his non-fiction book about the case, as Mr. B. When police spoke to Mr. B, they were surprised by a number of things. First of all, he was a younger bisexual man who was barely a shade over 20 years old. He claimed to have befriended Bevan Spencer von Einem in June of 1979, at around the same time that Alan Barnes disappeared. Mr. B told investigators about the cooler von Einem had in the backseat of his car at all times, full of beer which he would then try and ply on young-looking men that were walking on the side of the road. Apparently, the two were successful in many of their endeavors. They preyed upon young men that were hitchhiking, and they would play themselves up as partygoers on their way to a fun social gathering. Mr. B told investigators about the drugs von Einem would encourage his passengers to take, which he described to them as no-dos, but was actually drugs such as rohypnol or mandrax. In the first part of the story, I told you about a young man named George, who claimed to have been picked up by a stranger and taken to the home of a transgendered woman. Mr. B, who we can only assume knew nothing of George or his statements to police, informed investigators about Bevan von Einem's transgendered friend, named Prue Furman, who would host him and any guest in exchange for drugs. Mr. B also told police about how von Einem's mother would leave for a relative's house every other weekend, allowing him free reign of the house. And he also described how von Einem's old home had a very particular kind of driveway, which would allow him to abduct young men and teenage boys, and take them from the driveway to his bedroom without being seen by any of the neighbors. Mr. B also claimed to have been present during several of these abductions, but insisted that he always left before things got sketchy. He described one incident in detail about how von Einem had drugged a pair of boys and begun sexually assaulting one in a way that was very reminiscent to how the 4 victims had been found, before he decided to get out of Dodge. Despite this hiccup in his testimony, alleging facts but avoiding any repercussions of his own, this was a huge get for the investigators. Not only was Mr. B filling in the gaps in the investigation where they had nothing, he was connecting von Einem to the actions of a serial predator operating in the area. Police finally had all they needed to begin building a case against Bevan Spencer von Einem. They had eyewitness testimony, they had von Einem implicating himself in multiple statements. They had statements claiming that he was a sexual predator of sorts, and now it was time to find the physical evidence. They arranged to search his home in the fall of 1983. The search went off without a hitch. In fact, it went a little too well for detectives to believe it was real. Police searched his home and his car. Sure enough, in the back seat of his car was a cooler, just as Mr. B had stated. Inside, things looked like a regular home. There was no apparent evidence of a crime scene. No blood spatter on the walls or a torture chamber, nothing like that. But von Einem openly admitted to having the drug rohypnol in the bathroom's medicine cabinet, which he had apparently obtained for sleep reasons. Inside von Einem's bedroom, he had a large harp, which he was apparently quite good at playing. This is random, but it would become part of von Einem's defense later on. However, when police searched his bedroom, they discovered a hidden ledge on the inside of his closet. There, still in the bottles that they had come in, were the drugs Valium, Mandrax, and Noctec. When he had been asked about the drugs, he had claimed to have had Mandrax in the past, but he claimed to have ran out in the preceding months. He had remained ignorant of both Valium and Noctec, and trace amounts of all of these drugs were found in the bloodstream of Richard Kelvin. Police had long believed that their killer, or killers, would have been a sort of high-intellect type, with the way that the bodies had been cleansed of evidence and meticulously abducted. However, von Einem appeared to be somewhat inept, a buffoon who had trouble simply covering his tracks. He had hidden the evidence linking him to a high-profile murder case like a Scooby-Doo villain would have. On the evening after that first search, investigator O'Brien remembered circling by Von Einem's home. He remembers staying for a good amount of time, parked down the street, just sitting and watching. In Von Einem's driveway was a car, which O'Brien would later discover belonged to a local businessman, who I'll refer to as Mr. R. Investigators would later go on to finger Mr. R as being an associate of Von Einem's, and a potential suspect, but never had enough evidence to move forward. However, on the night where Von Einem was officially searched as a suspect in the murder of Richard Kelvin, this acquaintance was there until the very early hours, providing some sort of counsel or support. A short time after this, on November 3rd, police arrested Bevan Spencer von Einem for the murder of Richard Kelvin. Over the next few months, as von Einem awaited trial, police began to tear his house upside down, looking for any forensic evidence that could link him to Richard Kelvin or any of the other young men. They took a good amount of hair fibers from his clothing and furniture to the labs, where it would take some time to test against the DNA of the victims. In the meantime, as police began to dig around von Einem's life, they discovered a few odd things. Many of his co-workers, who had worked with him for months or even years, described him as being very tame. He was a pretty quiet guy, but he also had bouts of being odd. Von Einem's friends and associates also had a little bit screwy with their personal lives. His acquaintance, who I referred to as Mr. R, owned a local 2-story business. When police did a search of the building, they discovered that almost all business was done on the bottom floor. The top floor was reserved for management, quote unquote, and one of the closed doors up there revealed an open room that contained just a mattress. This man, Mr. R, was also spotted by police scouring the local areas where gay men met up, and was seen hitting on younger-looking men whenever he could. He would apparently close his business almost every day at lunch to walk around some of the nearby gay hotspots, and police found this to be very odd for a man that seemed so professional from the outside. Mr. R also had a roommate who was allegedly involved with these murders in some capacity. His name was Stephen George Woodards, and he was an Adelaide area doctor who would be surrounded in claims of sexual assault for decades, until facing charges in 2011 for crimes he allegedly committed in 1981 and 1982. Ties linked these 3 men, Von Einem, Stephen George Woodards, and Mr. R, to other alleged group members, including Darrent Stevenson, a high-profile lawyer who was murdered by his teenage lover in 1979, a case that made international news when his body was discovered in his own freezer, and Gino Luigi Gambardella, one of Stevenson's associates who fled Australia in 1980 after multiple allegations tied him to sexual assaults of young men in the Adelaide area. These searches of Von Einem's associates led to no conclusive evidence, unfortunately. However, this was showing police the circles that Bevan Spencer von Einem ran in. A group of older men that preyed upon younger men. If what they were doing wasn't illegal, it was definitely unethical, and it bordered somewhere between the two at the very least. However, when the forensics returned from Von Einem's home, they discovered a clear link that would lead to prosecution. Up to this point in the story, Von Einem had denied any wrongdoing. He had been spotted with Alan Barnes in the days before his murder, had admitted to not only knowing Neil Muir, but carrying on a sexual relationship with him, and he had admitted to driving in the exact area Mark Langley was murdered at the exact time he was abducted. But he had claimed to have had nothing to do with the disappearance of Richard Kelvin. However, forensics proved otherwise. The clothes that Richard Kelvin went missing and was later discovered in contained fibers that linked directly to Von Einem's bedroom and his clothing. They found fibers from one of his cardigans on Richard's clothing, as well as fibers from his bed and floor. Now that he had supposedly been pinned, Von Einem chose to change his statement. Of course, this was totally unrelated to this burgeoning evidence, as Bevan Spencer von Einem toiled in a local jail. But, nonetheless, Von Einem chose to admit that on the night of Richard Kelvin's disappearance, he had encountered the young man. In his amended statement, he said that he had been driving in the area to pick up some food and was driving around Richard's neighborhood, looking for parking. And then, this is where Von Einem's story crosses over into disbelief. He claims that he had encountered Richard, who wanted to come along with him that evening, willingly. He stated facts that the newspapers already had. that Richard had been going through some issues at school, that sort of thing. And he said that he had talked to Richard as a friend. This took place at Von Einem's home, of course, where they simply talked and hugged and played Von Einem's harp for a couple of hours, before Von Einem dropped him off at a bus stop and gave him $20 to get back home. However, this goes against 3 strong points. 1. The fact that Kelvin had not gone willingly with whoever picked him up, based on the testimony of multiple witnesses that heard screams and shouts. And 2. That Von Einem had apparently been sick and bedridden all week long. Also, the fibers that examiners had found on Richard Kelvin's clothing implied that they were recent additions to his clothing, and since he had been held for over 5 weeks, it would have had to have been closer in time related to his discovery than his initial disappearance. This meant that the fibers would not have been present if he had been at Von Einem's home in June, but rather if his clothes had been at Von Einem's closer to Richard Kelvin's discovery in July. Needless to say, police and prosecutors didn't believe Von Einem's statement whatsoever. It was just further proof to them that he was no criminal genius, just a sicko trying to stay afloat as he began to drown. Now, by his own statement, he was the last known person to see Richard Kelvin alive. Prosecutors called for his trial immediately, and by the fall of 1984, Von Einem was pleading not guilty to the murder of Richard Kelvin. The trial of Bevan Spencer von Einem took place in 1984, and it was a relatively tame affair. After leaning on circumstantial evidence in the trial against Dr. Peter Milhouse in 1980, the police and prosecution wanted to go with a more heavy-handed approach, linking Von Einem with not only the drugs found in Richard Kelvin's system, but also the fibers linking Kelvin to Von Einem's home, and Von Einem's own sketchy alibi and excuses. Von Einem's defense was flimsy at best. He had already claimed to have taken Richard Kelvin back to his house on the night that he disappeared, but claimed to have been sick the entire week afterwards. Von Einem also claimed that in the conversations he had had with Richard Kelvin on the night he disappeared, that the young man was struggling with his bisexuality. His family wholeheartedly denied this, stating that he was heterosexual and had a girlfriend. Furthermore, there was no proof of this being the truth other than Von Einem's say-so. On November 5th, 1984, the jury deliberated for 7.5 hours, ultimately leaning in the direction of guilt. Bevan Spencer von Einem was found guilty of Richard Kelvin's murder, and sentenced to a punishment of life in Yatala labor prison. One of the first guests that would visit Von Einem in prison would be none other than Mr. R, the business owner that had been tied to Von Einem's nefarious activities. As he began his sentence, police looked forward. They were already chomping at the bit to try and pin him for any of the other murders, but were still absent the necessary proof. Justice had been found for one victim, but the police still had 4 related unsolved murders. Sadly, over 30 years later, the same thing can still be said. Over the next few years, things were relatively quiet on the investigative front. Police were trying to find a link between Von Einem and the other murders, to at least extract some kind of information out of him or his associates. All that they had was the circumstantial evidence of the drugs found in Von Einem's possession, which was more of a slam dunk in Richard Kelvin's case than any of the others. Kelvin had been held and tortured for weeks, meaning that almost all of the drugs found in his system had also been found at Bevan Spencer von Einem's home. Meanwhile, Alan Barnes and Mark Langley showed trace amounts of some drugs, but not all. And unlike Richard Kelvin, there was no forensic or physical evidence linking Von Einem to their disappearances. As the years passed, and the 4 unsolved murders languished in cold case hell, people began to speculate about 2 questions. The first one was, did Bevan Spencer von Einem commit the crimes? The second was, if he did he do it alone? Mr. R, one of Von Einem's closest associates, visited him multiple times in prison. Police still suspected him as being one of their main suspects. He seemingly scoured the local gay hotspots for young-looking men, in a daily repetition that seemed as well-rehearsed as any. The upstairs office, which contained only a mattress and was kept private, still stumped investigators and left them wanting to charge him with anything, really. But unfortunately, there was nothing to connect him to the crimes other than his association with von Einem and his sketchy behavior. However, most surprising was that an anonymous caller would call in and suggest that Mr. R had something to do with the unsolved murders, which gave police extra ammunition to observe him for anything out of the ordinary. Police continued to use Mr. B as an informant, trying to use the information he had about von Einem and link it to any acquaintances or accomplices that may have been present. Unfortunately, in an effort to extradite himself from any of the crimes, police had no specifics to go on. Mr. B would claim that he had seen Alan Barnes with von Einem before his death, but that was the same type of circumstantial evidence that police wanted to avoid. In an effort to go even further than that, Mr. B would then claim that he had personally overheard a discussion between von Einem and his friend, Mr. R. Apparently, during this conversation, Mr. B alleges that von Einem expressed interest in making a snuff film, quote-unquote, of Alan Barnes. This would actually fit into what another anonymous caller had stated years beforehand, about there being a snuff film made of Alan Barnes, but this was unfortunately impossible to prove. Mr. B would also sensationally state that von Einem had confessed to having involvement in the abduction of the Beaumont children in 1966 and the Adelaide Oval abductions of Christy Gordon and Jeannie Ratcliffe in 1973. There was no proof of these statements, sadly, but Mr. B's statements regarding them seemed convincing to police at the time. Even as the months began to melt into years, police were happy to have Mr. B to fall back on, to learn more about von Einem's secrets. Unfortunately, they kept getting roadblocked by Mr. B himself, when he would lead police down the dark avenue of von Einem's crimes, but remove himself entirely and escape all responsibility. It was a survival mechanism, of course, but it made police very wary of trusting anything he said. This was further proven when the sister of Mr. B was contacted by police and gave conflicting testimony. She stated that Mr. B had told her of an occasion where he had participated in the abduction and murder of a young man, which resulted in him throwing a body off of a bridge. To investigators, this meant that Mr. B might have had more involvement in the murder of Alan Barnes than originally thought. But after almost a decade since the crime was committed, that would be a dead end. In 1988, police created a reward for information. $250,000 if someone was able to bring forth information that led to any resolution regarding the murders of Alan Barnes, Neil Muir, Peter Stogneff, or Mark Langley. This renewed interest led to a revival in cries for justice, and police began working on a case against von Einem for the murders of Alan Barnes and Mark Langley. These two, at least, had been found with drugs in their system, loosely tying them to the murder of Richard Kelvin. A year later, in 1989, the reward for information leading to an arrest was then doubled and was now $500,000. In 1990, von Einem was preparing to stand trial for these two additional crimes, police figuring that if they pinned two more murders to von Einem, it would make it easier to convict him for the separate murders of Neil Muir and Peter Stogneff. Unfortunately, before the case could even go to trial, the prosecution began to fall apart under the weight of Mr. B's testimony. It was too sensational, too unrealistic to stand up to scrutiny, and the fact that his own sister was testifying against him, stating that he was the type to make up stories to get himself out of a pickle, put police on edge. If they messed up this trial against von Einem, they would not be able to try him again, even if new evidence came to light in the future. So, swallowing their pride, the prosecution pulled the case, hoping for more evidence to be unearthed in the future. Sadly, it still never has. Over the years, the story of these murders would become a bit of an urban legend. Not only in Australia, but around the world. When one police officer was interviewed regarding the case, he made the quip of breaking up the happy family, in regards to an alleged conspiracy involving von Einem and other suspects. This would go on to be how the case was referred to. The Family Murders, a collection of crimes committed by gay men in Adelaide that conspired to rape, torture, and murder young men. It's easy to point out a conspiracy theory and find flaws with it, but it's also harder to figure out how a buffoon like Bevan Spencer von Einem could escape justice if he was the sole perpetrator of all these acts. He wasn't particularly smart. He worked as a middling accountant for a mid-end supply company, and he lived at home with his mother. His idea of hiding evidence was to put it on the inside ledge of his closet, where police were able to easily find. And that's not even including his alibis, which seemed to change based on what he thought the police knew. Police didn't think he was smart enough to commit the crimes and get away with it, especially since some of the other related crimes showed signs of medical how-to. Neil Muir's body was mutilated beyond recognition, but was done so by at least an amateur surgeon. The same could be said of Mark Langley, whose corpse showed the signs of being operated on, with the surgical cut below his belly button. Von Einem showed no signs of any medical expertise, and most likely would not have been able to perform such a surgery. This leads to two different possibilities. The first of which is that there was a criminal similar to Von Einem operating in the same area at around the same time. Which is possible. If anything, the last few years have shown us that a good amount of sickos were in the same area at the same time. But the more likely possibility is that these deviants were somehow connected, perhaps working together or conspiring to achieve the same disgusting goals. I personally lean towards the latter. Not out of an effort to be a conspiracy nut, but rather, I just think that Bevan Spencer von Einem was too much of a, I don't know how to phrase it, an idiot to commit all the crimes on his own. I think he may have been a gopher of sorts for the group, and maybe was responsible for abducting the young men, but I don't believe he was the only person involved. At the very least, I think someone else performed the surgical procedure on Mark Langley. Over the past few decades, police have agreed. In 2008, the investigation into the family murders was finally reopened, as police began to re-examine some of the long-forgotten evidence. This time, they were able to test it for DNA and forensics, but unfortunately, none of it came back with any matches. The police had narrowed down the description of 3 suspects, who they allege may have worked with Bevan Spencer von Einem to commit the 4 unsolved murders. The description of the 3 suspects is as follows. Suspect number 1. An eastern suburbs businessman. Visited von Einem after his 1984 conviction. Interviewed in late 1983 and denied involvement in the Kelvin murder. Has also denied knowledge of the other murders, despite an informant telling police he saw him with von Einem and an unconscious Alan Barnes on the night Barnes was abducted in June 1979. Refused to answer questions when approached as part of the cold case review. This is the suspect that I've been identifying as Mr. R throughout this episode. For legal reasons, I won't disclose this suspect's real name, but let me just say that you could find it if you're knowledgeable in Google Foo. This is the suspect the police have had the most interest in, regarding the 4 unsolved murders. Suspect number 2. A former Adelaide doctor who is well known in gay circles. Former lover of a well-known Adelaide lawyer. The pair used to pick up, drug, and abuse young men, known to have supplied drugs to von Einem and suspect number 1, which were used to incapacitate hitchhikers. Lives in Sydney and refused to answer questions as part of the cold case review. This suspect was publicly outed in 2011 in regards to a different investigation. His name is Stephen George Woodards, and he appeared in court to defend himself against 5 charges of sexual assault against young men. The incidents he defended against range from January of 1982 to August of 1984. Online theorists have speculated that the well-known Adelaide lawyer that Woodards had a love affair with was none other than Darren Stevenson, the well-known gay lawyer who was murdered by his teenage lover, David Zack, in 1979. I also don't find it a coincidence that Alan Barnes, the first family victim, was abducted and killed just 13 days after the death of Stevenson. Rumors have long circulated that Stevenson had had an interest in Alan Barnes in the weeks before his death, and that all of these men ran in the same clique that included Bevan Spencer von Einem and Stephen George Woodards himself. I assume that the 2011 case against him failed, or the charges were dropped, as the last I could find of Woodards put him in Bondi, a suburb of Sydney, Australia. Suspect number 3. A former male prostitute who is a close friend of von Einem and suspect number 1. Police have considerable information that implicates him in picking up, drugging, and sexually abusing hitchhikers. Believed to have been with von Einem and suspect number 1 when Kelvin was abducted, but has denied this. Now a bus driver in Brisbane, he fled Adelaide shortly after the cold case review was launched. This is the suspect that I have identified as Mr. B throughout this episode. It's very possible that his name was leaked by a newspaper in 1989, but I don't want to get into a guessing game and risk legal action taken against myself. This suspect is perhaps the trickiest of the lot. Police believe, now as they do then, that this individual had more information than he was letting on. He constantly implicated Bevan Spencer von Einem to places and dates, but had an excuse for himself, or would consistently state that he was involved with von Einem's abductions up to a certain point. However, these are just the 3 main suspects that police have identified throughout the years and felt comfortable releasing the descriptions of to the public. It's possible, if not downright likely, that there are even more individuals involved who still roam free today. The case of the family murders has remained in the Australian zeitgeist for years now, and for good reason. Criminologist Alan Perry has speculated that there may be dozens of victims, perhaps up into the triple digits. After all, over 38,000 people go missing in Australia every single year, over 1,000 of which are never found. Who's to say that any of the open missing persons reports of young men from South Australia are not related to these murdered men? In 2014, the family members of Trevor Peters were going through his belongings in an area of eastern Adelaide known as Kensington. He had died a short time beforehand, and his family figured that it was about time to start going through his stuff and taking care of matters. Trevor Peters had been a gay man, and he ran around the same circles as Bevan Spencer von Einem and his associates in the late 1970s and early 1980s. As his family members sorted through his belongings, they found a diary. This diary, written by Peters decades before its discovery, went into detail about his relationship with von Einem and the others that ran in their social circle. Trevor Peters' diary alleged that von Einem had discussed the abduction of Alan Barnes with his hairdresser, Dennis St. Dennis. And, according to Peters' diary, the pair had apparently taken pictures of Barnes during the week that he was missing. Normally, this would just be a speculative lead, a man alleging that a convicted killer had a conversation, in public, with his hairdresser about an open crime. But this diary had other, more important details, such as the name of von Einem's associates, including the correct identities of the 3 main suspects, whose names police had not released at the time. This diary also linked others to the same band of killers that Australia had called the Family for decades. Another point of credibility in Trevor Peters' favor. He lived just a house away from the 2 transgendered women that Bevan Spencer von Einem allegedly used to lure young men to. The name of one of these transgendered women has never been released, other than the fact that she was apparently the sibling of an Olympic wrestler, which is an odd detail to release. But the other was publicly outed as Prue Furman, who would actually die in 2010. Many have theorized that one, or both, of these women were involved in the abduction and murder of the 5 victims. Perhaps one was even the high-pitched voice that witnesses recall hearing during Richard Kelvin's abduction. Trevor Peters' diary also alleged that von Einem, along with Dennis St. Dennis and perhaps another associate, rented an apartment in eastern Adelaide during the time period that the crimes occurred. However, it has now been 3 years since this diary was discovered, and police seem to be no closer to solving this investigation than they were 30 years ago. Trying to conclude this story is pretty close to impossible for me, which is why I find this next section pretty hard to deal with. Over the years, people have pointed fingers at a conspiracy of sexual offenders who perpetrated these attacks. Others have pointed out the idea that this is ridiculous, and pointed out other such cases where these types of conspiracy accusations proved fruitless. However, I would just like to point out all of the following figures. Mr. R, the number 1 suspect behind Bevan Spencer von Einem, who they allege committed the family murders alongside the only convicted culprit. Stephen George Woodards, the local doctor and surgeon who faced 5 charges of sexual assault against young men in 2011. He was revealed to be the investigation's number 2 suspect, who also happened to live with Mr. R during this time period. Mr. B, the witness that cooperated with police against von Einem, but was likely guilty of some of the same crimes. He openly admitted to being with von Einem on many occasions where he drugged young men, but police believe he was responsible for much more. Prue Furman and her roommate, both transgendered women who allegedly held parties in which they lured young men to their home in exchange for drugs. Darrence Stevenson, a high-profile lawyer who was murdered in 1979 by his teenage lover. He was a known associate of many of these figures, and a noted philanderer who enjoyed having sex with young men. Gino Luigi Gambardella, a chiropractor who was close friends with both Stevenson and Bevan Spencer von Einem. He fled Australia in the early 1980s after multiple allegations of sexual assault put him in the investigation's crosshairs. Robert William Simons, also known as Mother Goose for his peculiar way of walking. He was a bookmaker accused of dozens of sexual assaults ranging from the 1970s through the 1990s. He stood trial in 2011 of multiple accounts of sexual assault, and was acquitted only because the evidence did not stand up almost 30 years later. He had found a way to escape charges the entire time. Peter Liddy was Southern Australia's longest tenured magistrate when he was convicted in 2001 of multiple sex crimes, including the sexual assaults of young men ranging as far back as 1969. Many of the assaults he allegedly committed could not even be tried because the statute of limitations had expired. Richard Dutton Brown was another of South Australia's magistrates who was accused of multiple sexual assaults in the late 1970s and early 1980s. He was a gay man who prowled in the same hotspots as the other family murder suspects, and he died in 2010 before police could formulate an actual case against him. Rick Marshall, the host of children's TV programs in the 1970s and 1980s, was the ringleader of a child sex ring that focused on young boys. He was convicted of multiple offenses in 2012, but because of his old age, was sentenced to only 25 years of house arrest. Last but not least, Donald John Storen, a well-known boxing promoter and close friend of former South Australian Premier Don Dunstan. Donald John Storen left Australia to live in Indonesia, where he was later convicted of sexually assaulting and raping 4 boys in the mid-2000s. If you think it's crazy that one or more of these many suspects may have communicated with another when a clear link between several has already been established, you may need to think again. We already know that several of these accused, and in some cases convicted, sexual predators were acquaintances. Who's to say more are not involved? I think believing that Bevan Spencer von Einem acted alone is the easy answer to help us sleep better at night. The hard answer, and in my opinion the more realistic one, is that he had an accomplice. Maybe just one, but perhaps several. And for over 30 years now, all of them have escaped justice. While the case file on Richard Kelvin may have been closed, and Bevan Spencer von Einem has been sitting behind bars for over 30 years, the abductions, rapes, and murders of Alan Barnes, Neil Muir, Peter Stogneff, and Mark Langley remain unresolved. If any of you would like to do any further reading on the story, you could head to the podcast website/blog, which is theunresolvedpodcast.com, to find sources I used when writing these episodes. The major source I used was the book Youngblood, written by an investigator behind the case, Bob O'Brien. It's chock full of details, many of which I couldn't find a place for in these episodes, but if you're interested, I'd really encourage you to check it out. If you head over to the podcast blog, you could also find links to the social media accounts, such as Facebook and Twitter. You could send emails to theunresolvedpodcast@gmail.com, no spaces, or you could call in and text at 831-200-3550. You could support the podcast by heading to patreon.com/unresolvedpod. I have a few tiers set up, and each get you access to some exclusive content. It's nothing game-breaking so far. It just gets you access to early listens of each episode's rough cut, any streams that Tyson or I set up, the ability to vote for future episodes, that kind of thing. I'm never going to paywall the podcast, but this is a good way to help financially support the podcast while also getting a little something in return. We're always trying to think up fun stuff to give back to the Patreon supporters, and rest assured we have some more cool stuff coming up in the near future. Speaking of, because of your Patreon donations, I have managed to buy some new pieces of equipment, and this is going to allow me to not only conduct interviews, but I can do more stuff in person. The quality is going to be better in the future, but anyone who's made a donation to Patreon or the PayPal, thank you so much. It's going to come in handy, and I hope you'll be hearing a much better sounding podcast in the near future. Stay tuned. But before I conclude the episode, I would like to thank all of the new Patreon supporters who have helped make future episodes possible. These supporters are Elliot, Mac, Jeannie, Francesca, Joy, Carlos, Joseph, Desiree, Karina, Samantha, John, Jay, Michael, Jarrett, Marty, Nathan, and Anatoly. All of you, I can't thank you enough. And, of course, before I wrap up this overly long Academy Award outro, I'd be remiss if I didn't thank producer extraordinaire Tyson Nordgren, who just pulls magic out of a hat every single episode. He produces the music you hear throughout each episode, and he manages to make my rough recordings sound nearly professional through computer magic. We all really owe him a lot for making this podcast sound as good as it does. So, Tyson, thank you yet again. But that's it for this dark and twisted tale. I hope to be back sooner rather than later with another interesting unresolved story, but until then, stay safe. Adios.
you